Good morning and welcome to Gabecast. Gabecast is a weekly program that discusses politics and culture. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Karl von Seidltz, who is a professor of political science at the University of Maryland. We're glad to have Karl with us today because he's discussing a rather controversial topic, the subject of nonviolent revolution. And his recently publications have focused on the efficacy of nonviolent revolution as compared to violent revolution. And I'm really pleased to have him on the podcast today. So, welcome. It's good to have you here, Dr. von Seidlitz.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Well, good that you're here today. So, you've been exploring nonviolence recently in your work, and I'm glad you're here to talk about this because I actually have some questions. I guess the first one is what do you mean by nonviolent revolution, and what might be misconceptions people have about what nonviolent revolution is?
Yeah, so with the definition of nonviolent revolution or nonviolent tactics is the resistance of oppression or dictatorship through nonviolent or non-physical means. Basically, just resistance without the use of weapons or deadly force.
Okay, so resistance without the use of deadly force. So that to me seems kind of intuitive. Nonviolence, no deadly force.
Yeah.
I guess the question I have is, what do you think are some things that people, maybe somebody like me who hasn't really studied this, I think nonviolence, I think of kind of kumbaya moments. What is it? What are misconceptions people have about nonviolent revolution?
Yeah, there are a lot of misconceptions with nonviolent revolutions or just civil disobedience in general. The most common one is like that it's that the main thing that the reason why nonviolent revolutions or civil disobedience works is that it just changes the hearts of their oppressors or dictators.
That's certainly what I always thought about it. I thought that was the whole point of like King and his work in the civil rights movement in the United States.
Yeah, well, King did apply. His rhetoric did change the hearts of many people, and but that we're not discrediting him. It's just that that's not the main reason why civil disobedience and nonviolence works, though.
So I guess my question would be, what is it then? If it's not changing the hearts of the oppressor, what is nonviolent revolution? What is it that I'm misunderstanding here? What are maybe some misconceptions that I have here?
Well, with nonviolent revolutions, well, the reason why they work is through several different tactics that revolutionaries employ.
What are those tactics?
There are two different main types of tactics. The first one is concentration tactics. Tactics of demonstration and protests.
That's certainly what I always associate with nonviolent revolution.
Yeah, they're the flashy ones. They're the ones like for the purpose of making the movement of the voice or the voice of the movement heard, and bringing their discontentions to the view of the public.
So you're thinking about like large mass demonstrations, things like that.
Yeah, to galvanize and like gather support for their movement.
So King's March on Washington or the Salt March of Gandhi would be examples of that.
Yeah, and send a message to the government.
Okay, I gotcha. So what other tactics do they have?
Yeah, the second main one is dispersion tactics, actually. For example, an example of dispersion tactics would be the nonviolent revolution in the Philippines.
So you're talking about against Ferdinand Marcos in the 1980s.
Yeah, they employed they employed a tactic of like shutting off everyone in their homes in certain districts or areas turned off their lights and turned off all the power coming into their home in certain districts, fluctuating the power grid.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah, and making the regime have a tough time, transporting power to different cities, and it was just a simple thing that they did, just turn off all the lights in a district or whatever.
Well, that's very clever. You can't exactly go arrest people for not turning their lights on.
Yeah, that's a sort of sabotage that you might see, and of course there are strikes, hunger strikes or work strikes, or like in Poland when they were resisting the Soviets, they went on strikes against farming coal or whatever, so the Soviets wouldn't get their fuel, and they went on strikes against operating trains and transportation, so they couldn't very well, or the regime couldn't very well transport their troops or whatever. And Gandhi with his hunger strike, which helped in like driving out the British, like that kind of stuff.
Okay, so you're thinking about like sabotage on the one hand, with non-violent
Yeah,
sabotage, and then
nonviolence.
you're talking about mass movements of protest, and you're talking about strikes. I could see how those things might be successful. It's more than just walking around with signs. That makes sense.
Yeah, the strikes are like basically like coordinated efforts like to target certain areas of the regime's power. While the protests are showing like the people that they're or or like basically like it's like a billboard versus the thing holding up the billboard with
Oh,
like the strikes like and like little effort measures like holding up and like supporting the bigger measures or the more flashy measures which is on the sign.
so I guess my next question would be this: what's the point? And I don't mean that to be offensive. What I'm asking is this: I could see how strikes and sabotage, nonviolent sabotage, and perhaps civil disobedience, those things, and mass demonstration could be effective against a regime. But why not just be violent? And here's my argument. Listen very carefully, Dr. von Seidlitz. My question is, wouldn't it be faster and easier just to simply attack the regime? Why go to all the trouble of the strikes and these other kinds of measures when it seems like just a quick violent strike or a violent attack against an oppressive, evil regime, wouldn't that actually be more effective?
Well, when you're talking about violent measures or taking into consideration of violent revolutions and stuff, you run into a multitude of problems. Like there in this study by Comparative Politics in 2018, it said that the studies of social movements suggest that violent techniques may have a number of counterproductive effects for a protest campaign. They
What would those counterproductive effects? So the violence would have a counterproductive effect.
Yeah, and it cites three main effects that might uh, inhibit like progress in the revolution.
Oh, okay. What are those?
Yeah, the first one is that it may alienate current and potential supporters of the movement.
Okay, that makes sense to me because if you're violent, people might turn against you
Yeah,
because just the fact that you're violent that scares them,
yeah.
especially the middle class or moderates.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And like the second one is that it provokes a devastating coercive response from the authorities.
So this is like a push or push back thing. That if
Yeah,
I'm violent in the streets, then I'm going to provoke a violent response. Whereas if it's non-violent, like shutting your electricity off or not doing something or civil disobedience, you're not as likely to provoke a massive violent response from the government.
yeah. Like as you can see in like some violent revolutions, like the Russian Revolution with Lenin, when he amassed his Red Army to go fight the Mensheviks, the Mensheviks responded with a coordinated military attack on the Bolsheviks.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. While the nonviolent revolutions could elicit a military response, not saying that it won't. It's just it's harder to it's harder and more costly for a regime to like try to suppress like thousands of people just doing like trying to shut off their lights or whatever. It's harder for them to do that than like to target specific military targets.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And the third reason is that it may dampen support for protests in the international community.
Okay, now why is that significant?
Well, typically with revolutions, or I can even cite an example like in the 1700s with American Revolution. International support is very key for few conflicts. Like with the American Revolution, like wouldn't have succeeded without France's like immense aid and support with guns and ships and ammunition
So,
to fight the British.
of course, that was a violent revolution. So,
Yeah.
So how would that apply, say, for the American Civil Rights Movement? Do you think?
Well, that was a violent revolution, but I'm just saying, like you can see as a side of that example, how international aid can help aid or break like a revolution. Or
Okay, I
whatever.
see your point. So your basic point, and it's fair enough that if someone's violent, international community is going to feel more uncomfortable supporting violent actors versus nonviolent actors because their cause looks more just and it maybe isn't as costly for them in terms of
Yeah,
international press.
better
and support
for
around the
international PR.
revolution. Okay. So are there any? Are there any other reasons why you think nonviolence is more effective than a violent revolution? You've mentioned uh, international support. You've mentioned lack of a pushback from the regime. Is that all there is to it, or are there any other reasons why nonviolent revolution might be more successful than violent revolution?
Well, yes. In a study done by Erica Chenoweth, she was studying. She did a study on revolutions from the 1900s to about around 2006, a comparative study, and she found that the success rate of nonviolent revolutions versus was twice as effective as violent ones.
Okay, so wait a minute. So she stayed over 100 years in her study and found that they were twice as effective in basically the 20th century.
Yeah.
That's pretty powerful.
And she found that nonviolent revolutions also had a higher rate of sustained higher diversity than violent ones.
What does that mean?
It means that it applied or encompassed more people, or more different kinds of people. You know, like for example, with a violent revolution, you only apply to a select group of radicals.
Okay.
Like, and the people who are able to, like, hold a gun and, like, able to attend military operations and stuff.
So you basically get more people involved when it's a nonviolent revolution.
Yeah, with nonviolent revolutions, women, old people, children, everyone can participate in the revolution, not just, like the soldiers or, yeah, because even, like, with the children, they can, paint signs, for the revolution, attend strikes, people can just not go to work. It just applies to a general, like, wider audience.
Course. And there's those famous pictures of the civil rights, of the involvement of children in the civil rights movement in the United States.
Yeah.
With MLK in the. So, I have to admit, I was very much a skeptic of this, and I was planning on giving you more pushback when you came on, Dr. von Seidltz. It certainly was, but at this point, I really see where you're coming from, and I'm interested in further researching this topic. I think that you've shown me that it's not pie in the sky, that there really is a practical benefit to this. So thank you for coming on our show today, and I hope to have you again on Gabecast. Thank you, Dr. von Seidltz.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.